This is the United States State Department speaking about the Taliban.
The UN Security Council issued a joint press statement earlier today calling for a new government that is united, inclusive, and representative, including with the full and meaningful participation of women.
Joining me now to talk about that is the senior policy analyst for the Independent Women's Forum, my friend Inez Stepman. Inez, I don't have a better way to describe it. These people are children who do not reside in this thing we call the real world. How did we get these people in government?
Yeah, it's completely idiotic, and I don't really have any other words for it. But this is what happens when you hand over governance to people who actually haven't suffered any of the consequences of their decision making or been held accountable for it for 30 years. And I think that like we all knew, for example, that political consultants jump from campaign to campaign, no matter how terribly they've failed in running a campaign. Like Jeb Bush's campaign manager made like $1 million in 2016, right? But the problem is that model is not limited to political consultants. It's literally millions of bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., including in the Pentagon and the higher ranks of the military.
Okay, Inez, I'm going to get back to Biden and his messaging in Afghanistan in a moment, but I can't let this go. On a macro level, you're so good at this stuff. How did this happen? Is this just par for the course for late-stage empires? They just end up run by morons? Is this an education system problem? I know you're always hot on that, as am I. What happened? How did we end up with these people? These people run our military. They run the CIA. They run the FBI. We're run by losers. How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's really, I think, the most difficult thing to accept. I think a lot of people on the right, we thought that the idiocy and this kind of total and complete incompetence was confined to certain institutions, right? We knew that the media was full of incompetents and idiots who weren't going to be held responsible for any real world consequences of their actions. We knew that, of course, the academy was graduating. That means universities are graduating ranks and ranks of these like lunatics and people, more importantly, people who have never actually, again, faced any consequences. Their job is essentially, to write the narrative, and they don't actually face real world consequences for doing so. But I think the really disappointing and dispiriting thing for people on the right has been the realization over the past 4 to 5 years, culminating now with these images we're seeing out of Kabul, that in fact, we thought the military was kind of exempt from this, right? If you look at long-term trust polls of the American people in their various institutions, everything has been underwater for a very long time, from all the branches of the government to the media and to even churches, for example, the police. But the two bright spots in terms of institutional trust were small businesses, which have been devastated in the last year and a half, and the military, and particularly people on the right, had enormous amount of faith in the U.S. military, in our intelligence services, in the CIA, and then domestically, the FBI. We thought that those were the quote unquote serious people. And of course, many of the people who are actually suffering the consequences, the troops on the ground and the lower ranks of the military, they are serious people. But it seems like completely undeniable after this farce of regardless of what you think, even if you think withdrawal, like I think actually was the right response here in Afghanistan. But how is it that our intelligence services said that this would take 90 days and it took 2 or 3, right? How is that kind of incompetence possible? How is it that we didn't evacuate? We evacuated our base before we evacuated American citizens or Afghans that fought alongside us. It's completely disorganized. How is it that the Taliban is doing donuts in our Humvees, right? Like it doesn't even matter at some point what the ideology behind this. This is just massive and complete incompetence and failure.
No, it is. It is shocking, and I'll be honest, as I have been, it is embarrassing. We are currently being embarrassed internationally on the world stage, and that is a bitter pill to swallow. Nevertheless, here we are. Okay, let's set Afghanistan kind of aside for a moment and focus on the political messaging of it. The Biden administration has blown this so badly with their messaging and the vacation and the brief statement and no questions. It's like they took one gigantic mistake and did everything possible to make themselves look worse every single second of the day. How did that happen? I realize Joe Biden is a half-functional adult. He still has professional political people around him, I would hope.
Well, that's the point, right? Our professional political class, our bureaucracy, the top levels of every institution are incompetent, including politically. Yeah, of course, it's terrible optics to have the president of the United States basically non-existent for days as these images start to come out. Then he finally gives a speech yesterday, and the speech does not address any of the actual questions involved, right? He gives a speech essentially saying why we need to leave Afghanistan, but he doesn't address the absolute chaos that is happening as he's giving that speech and in the days prior. I mean, he's essentially counting on the fact that the American people are too stupid to tell the difference between the justification for why we should have left Afghanistan and the manner in which his administration carried that, policy out. They're counting on the fact that people cannot distinguish between those two things. And I think they're also, we'll find out in the coming days, whether Americans are more Jacksonian in terms of their foreign policy or they are more genuinely isolationist, i.e., there is a middle ground position, which is to project strength without staying for decades and engaging in projects of nation building, but still holding the kind of respect and fear that would prevent these kinds of Saigon-like imagery coming out of Kabul or images of the Taliban, sitting in our embassy. There has to be, in my view, some kind of middle ground. That middle ground has been traditionally termed Jacksonian foreign policy in the United States, where we basically don't care much about the rest of the world until they punch us in the face, in which case we completely obliterate them. That seems to be more of the basic instinct behind the average American's opinion, and we'll see if the average American's opinion is at this point so isolationist that they didn't care how we got out of Afghanistan, and they don't even care about this, as you call it, humiliation on the world stage. I tend to think that they will, and that these images will become iconic. And by the way, I think that's why we'll start to see them disappear off of social media networks in the coming weeks, and the media try very, very hard to move on from this story and to prevent additional video and stories coming out of Kabul once Americans leave.
Hey, thanks so much for watching The First on YouTube. If you liked what you saw, go ahead and like and subscribe. You heard me. Like it, subscribe. You'll get a lot more of it and a lot more of me.